Hi everyone. I'm really short, so I'm going to sit here instead of standing at the podium because it usually covers my head. My name is Jafreen. I'm the executive director of the Asian American Writers Workshop. I took a look at the list of sessions and the list of participants. I have a feeling this is going to be a little bit of a departure from what you all have been hearing and discussing. I'm going to talk probably less about computers and more about people. The Asian American Writers Workshop is a national literary nonprofit. We're based in New York City. We've been around since 1991. We just hit our 30th anniversary last year. And we support and amplify work by Asian and Asian diasporic writers. That sounds super broad, so I'll get into what that actually means in a little bit. Writing, there's kind of an inherent dichotomy in writing in that it's done in solitude, but it also demands community. It's one of the only art forms that really requires community. And that's where organizations like ours come in. We see ourselves as helping build community for writers. We originally started in a basement in St. Mark's Place, and our founders actually kind of conceptualized the workshop in a diner in New York City, where all good things happen. Part of it was feeling like there was no place for them in the New York City literary scene. They were going to readings, they were going to workshops, they were trying to workshop their stories in like the traditional workshopping model, and they just weren't finding that sense of community in the literary field or scene or whatever you want to call it. And so, they did what a lot of trailblazers do, they built their own. And it started very small. It was a few people in a basement, like I said, in St. Mark's. I think they were like underneath a Gap store. And so people had to actually walk through the Gap store to get down to this strange place where Asians would meet up and read and write and sell books. It was one of the first kind of Asian-centered bookstores in New York City, little known fact. And since then we've grown and we've become a lot larger and we do a lot more, which I'll also get into in a little bit. But for an organization to have the word Asian American in its name, there are tensions there. What does Asian American even mean? And there are consequences for what it means when these works are being published and you're talking about like an Asian American writer. People are only called Asian when they're not in Asia. If you're in India, you're gonna consider yourself Indian. You only become Asian when you immigrate to the United States or Europe or wherever you go outside of the continent. And that has implications in kind of how stories by Asians are understood, right? Like there's no great Asian American novel. There can't be. Asia is dozens of countries, hundreds of languages, so many dialects. Like how can you even, calling yourself an Asian American writer is fine, but like what does that even mean? Kind of nothing, really. But also everything, because there is also power in this kind of pan-Asian solidarity, which is where the term Asian American is not old, it's new. It came out in the 1970s when college students on the West Coast actually recognized the power of kind of pan-Asian organizing. So that's where it was born. And so there is no kind of canon of Asian American writers because the term itself has only been around for a couple decades. A lot of people joke that the only thing Asians actually have in common is that they all take their shoes off before coming into your home. So there is no like through line. There's no one story that can identify this large group of people. And that comes through in when you're talking about amplifying stories by Asian Americans. How do you do it in a way where you're not pigeonholing people? Where you're not forcing people to be defined by their trauma, by their oppression. Asian writers tell more stories than stories about wartime. They tell more stories than stories about partition or, being torn from their homelands. There's more to that. But so often in this kind of attempt we need to tell an Asian story, Asian writers are stymied. They're stuck in, having to tell this story that they're told is the only one that people want to hear. So what we think a lot about at the workshop is how do we create an ecosystem? What do we do so that writers aren't necessarily defined by that trauma, or they aren't pigeonholed into this corner? They don't need to tell the story that they're being told they need to tell versus the one they want to tell. Our solution is something that Viet Thanh Nguyen has called narrative plenitude. It's this idea that there is more than one story to be told, and so there needs to be avenues and channels and platforms so that there are more stories. There's an anecdote that we've heard often at this point. I don't know if it's kind of an urban legend or not, but Netflix turned down the Rammy's show, called Rammy, because legend says that they already had a Muslim guy show. They had Aziz Ansari show, Master of None. And so anybody that knows anything about those two shows knows they're completely different forms of storytelling, completely different stories, completely different communities. But there's this kind of instinct to pigeonhole. Well, we already have a show by a Muslim guy. We don't need another one. And it happens in publishing too. Editors will turn down books. I already have a Korean writer. I don't need another one. So we push what we call narrative plenitude. What are we doing to make sure there are as many stories as possible out there, not limiting ourselves to just one Korean author, one Indian writer? There was a show, I think it was on Netflix, that came out called The Bling Empire, which is about just like very rich Asians in LA, and it's trashy, and it's reality TV, and it's wonderful. But there's also a great commentary on it where people actually praised the idea that this like mediocre reality show was finally out, because like finally, Asians don't have to always be brilliant. Because what happens is when there's only room for one, there's also pressure to be the best, to be completely representative of your group. So when something like a mediocre reality show comes out about Asians, that's actually a huge success. Because that's exactly what narrative plenitude is. Narrative plenitude means not everything is a best-selling novel. It means there's also room for mediocre work. The point is to have as many types of stories out there as possible. I've talked a lot about writing, and I know this is a publishing conference, so everyone's like, what are you talking about writing? But that I think is the point. I think a lot of times at publishing conferences, writers, storytellers aren't here. They're left out of the conversation. The people that are creating the content that all of you do such a great job in putting out into the world, that the publishing world puts out into the world, are not here. They're talked about, maybe, but they're often left out of the conversation. And when I say business, I mean, I say business intentionally. Traditional publishing, especially Big Five publishing, at its core is a business. Best-selling books, they don't just happen, they're made intentionally. And when you think about what type of business it is, it's a luxury business, which I don't think gets talked about often enough. A consumer that is going to spend 15 to 20 bucks on something that they have like shelves of in their home that they may or may not even read. As somebody who has shelves of books that I haven't read, I can attest to that fact. That's a luxury consumer. And that dictates the types of decisions that are made, the types of gatekeepers that have been there traditionally, right? And so this gatekeeping model for what is at its core a luxury business, makes it difficult for any writer. If you're an emerging writer and you don't have the right connection, like writing is hard. Being a commercially successful writer is hard. If you're a writer of color, it's even harder. Because in addition to the barriers that you face in terms of even making it, in terms of getting your book out there, you're also pigeonholed, the way I talked about before. You're also put into this corner of dealing with editors who tell you that your book isn't Indian enough. Maybe put a marigold in there somewhere. That'll really appeal to the mainstream audience, which is, Peter was too polite to say it earlier, mainstream often means white. It just does, right? So for us at the workshop, we have a lot of writers who are dealing with being tokenized, being forced to tell stories that pander, not being given the freedom and independence to tell the story that they want to be able to tell on their own terms. And you know, there's no easy solution, right? Like, it's too easy to just throw our hands up and be like, oh, the system sucks, there's nothing we can do. But it's also not realistic to say, well, let's get rid of all the gatekeepers. That's not gonna happen either. It's a huge industry and it exists in a certain way. So we think a lot of the workshop of, you know, how do we disrupt that a little bit? The ecosystem that we've created at the workshop has different goals internally and externally. Internally, we think a lot about community. We think a lot about support systems, how are writers, you know, given the opportunities and the safety to feel like they can write what they want, whether it's in our workshops, our events, our readings, things like that. Our digital magazine, where we do publish work by emerging writers of all genres. But it's also external. We have a lot of relationships with Big Five publishers, with agents, with people who are in the business. And so we think a lot about how are we connecting the writers that we know, because we've got our ears to the ground. We know who's out there writing brilliant work. One of our fellows who was in our fellowship program last year is nominated for a National Book Award this year. We pride ourselves on really incubating the next generation of Asian American literature. And we really work to leverage the relationships that we have. There is a new generation of publishers that are coming in who are really eager to disrupt the traditional publishing process, and it's been great for us to work with them. One of them, for example, was really frustrated at, you know, most editors at Big Five publishers don't even look at something if it's not agented. If you don't have an agent, your work doesn't even get read by an editor. Forget about whether it gets sold. And he came to us and said, what do we do? How do we change that? And so we have an annual session where our fellows, who we very biasedly believe are the most brilliant writers, pitch their work to the top leadership at one of the Big Five publishing houses. And that's the kind of work that's being done that doesn't get talked about a lot. There are people who are working and eager to disrupt traditional systems that have so long kept writers from our community out of the mainstream circles. So yeah, we're in this moment of high visibility, I think, for Asian Americans, for better or worse. The kind of violence that came out of, the early stages of the COVID pandemic, but even beyond that, just in the media, you have movies like Crazy Rich Asians, you have these like celebrity Diwali parties, that's trendy now. Across art and media, Asian Americans are making a mark. What I would, I guess, urge everybody here to remember is, not only have we been here, Asian Americans didn't just show up when Crazy Rich Asians came out. They've been here for all of American history. Some of the earliest Americans in the 1800s were from Asia. But I think more importantly that we're just getting started. I think there's a lot more to come. I don't know how I'm out of time. I think I'm okay, but it's also a small enough group that if anybody has questions, those are all the notes I have. If anybody has questions, if there's something I didn't cover that you thought I should or could have, I'm also happy to take a couple if we have some time. We have like 5 minutes, right? But if not, that's also okay.
Mine is not a question so much as a thank you. I am a writer. I'm here. I'm sure there are others here. I have had an editor tell me that I'm half Indian, that they already had an Indian book. And there was a third point you made that I also wanted to just tell you I was embodying and I was grateful for, but now I don't remember what it was. But anyway, thank you for bringing this voice to this conference.
I just want to say thank you. I'm so happy you're here.
So happy to be here.
I guess my question was about the digital magazine and how it relates to your the digital magazine and how it relates to your efforts to find more platforms for these voices.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a digital conference, so I just wanted to see how those things match up.
Yeah, so our magazine publishes, like I said, across genre. We publish poetry, we publish interviews, we publish a new flash fiction series, longer fiction, anything that's interesting, we'll publish it. We see it as a really important pipeline. Ming Chang, whose amazing debut came out 2 years ago and was critically acclaimed and won all the awards, you know, her first time ever being published was as a 16-year-old in our digital magazine. We have open calls throughout the year. We also have contributing editors that have connections. It's, for us, it serves as a lot of people's kind of first places where they're published. Their work isn't getting noticed or getting accepted by kind of other, you know, digital or print publications. And so it serves as an important pipeline and just another kind of training ground. I think there's something really special for a writer when you see that byline, even if it's not in like a print thing, if it's like on a website, and it gives us another way to showcase the brilliant work by the writers of our community.
What is the name of your digital magazine?
It's called The Margins. It's right on our website, aaww.org, which if I was a better ED, I would have said that earlier. aaww.org, everything we do, and we host, you know, we have a lot of different channels of programming. We have our digital magazine. We have one of the most active event series in the country. Even during COVID, we hosted 92 events last calendar year, most of them virtual now. As a part of kind of retaining that community and staying connected to our community even when we were physically not able to gather. We have our fellowship programs. We have 2 different fellowship programs that support emerging writers materially, and we host workshops for people to work on their craft. One of our favorite workshops to kind of brag about is Jubilee Lahiri once taught a class that in the class was Kathy Parkon, Minjin Lee, and Lisa Coe. I didn't talk about, and they were like baby writers then that nobody knew about. But we really pride ourselves on, you know, training and incubating the best and the brightest Asian American writers that hopefully you all are meeting today. I think there, maybe one more, we have another.
All well said. It's wonderful that you're here. I think part of what we're in the fundamental civilization paradigm shift is from nationalities into the human family. America is becoming a blended country. And so, I mean, I know you see Publishers Weekly, and you know there's all kinds of attention being paid to diverse writers. You haven't mentioned Africa, but a whole bunch of wonderful books have come out of Africa. So this is happening. It's happening worldwide, and it's only going to accelerate because 3.5 billion people are on phones all over the world. So this is all good. This is the way of the future. It's happening.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think to that point, translation, I think, is one of the most exciting fields in terms of work that's being done, in terms of scope for what can actually be put out there. There are canons outside of the Western one that are kind of open and bright for translating and appreciating and understanding. All right. Well, thank you. Have a great rest of the conference.